Today is Tuesday, 15 July 2008. We're at the Isaac Griswold Public Library in Whitehall, New York, and we are interviewing Mr. Wayne Senecal, who is a current resident. And Mr. Senecal, for the record, would you please state your full name and your date and place of birth, please?
My name is Wayne Robert Senecal. I was born in Mount Holley, Vermont on February 25th, 1934.
Okay, and did you attend school there?
No, we lived in Rutland, and I attended one-room country school just north of Rutland. It was known as the Middle Village School.
Okay, and did you eventually move to Whitehall?
We moved to Whitehall March 1st, 1943.
Okay, and that was during World War II, of course. And what do you remember about being a young boy growing up during World War II?
Well, I remember when the war started, my first real memory of the war was I was sitting at home in a platform rocker in our living room, listening to the radio, and President Roosevelt came on the air and said that we had been attacked by the Japanese and that we were now at war.
So you were about 7 or 8?
I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I don't know whether that sunk in too much at the time, but it did later. One of the first things we all started to do was everybody was out digging up scrap metal, turning it in for the war drives. And we'd go out and we'd pick milkweed pods because they'd use the floss for the life jackets, you know, for the sailors. Everybody wanted to do their part. I was probably in the first grade when the war started, and I remember, when you think back at it, it's kind of funny, but we had air raid drills. They would blow the air raid siren in the city of Rutland, and we'd hear the siren, and we'd have air raid drills. Like the Japanese and the Germans were going to bomb Rutland, but apparently at the time there was the serious possibility that it could happen. And what we had to do, we had to go into the woodshed and sit down on the wall away from the window and wait out the air raid. Looking back, it seems kind of funny, but we were serious.
Now, what line of work were your parents in? Or
My father was a farmer.
Okay.
And of course, during World War II, they had rationing. And the rationing didn't seem to affect the farmers so much because we grew most of our own food at that time anyway. Gasoline did affect us, but we used horses mainly for doing farm work, so it wasn't quite as critical as it would be today.
Now, as a farmer, did you have any problems getting what you needed to continue on with producing crops or milk, etc.? As far as equipment went, anything you needed, were there shortages in that regard?
You couldn't buy equipment unless you had a real high priority need. Most people made do with what they had. Like I say, we had horses that did most of our work. We had 3 horses, and we had one tractor that most of the winter just sat in the shed. We very seldom used it in the wintertime. And labor was a problem because most of the young men had gone off to war. And I remember, I think it was 1944, through the summer, we had a college student from Maryland, a girl who came up. They called her a farmerette at the time. And she came up and she worked on the farm throughout the summer. And we also had a friend, he became a friend, Archie Chesno from New York City. He was a New York City fireman, and he would spend his vacations coming up working on the farm. And he was a darn good worker and a good guy. And he did get injured later on in the fire department, but he at the end of the war, he went into the Navy. One of the things I remember most about or involvement. I think I had 6 uncles altogether that went into the service, and every one of them, they'd have a big party, a send-out party for them when they went.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody wanted to see them go, but they were all proud that they did go.
Mm-hmm.
My Uncle Donald and my Uncle George, especially, they were both Senecals. Uncle Donald served in France, and he was wounded at the Battle of the Bulge. And Uncle George served in Italy, and he was an ambulance driver in Italy. So they both see combat.
Mm-hmm.
The other uncles I'm not so sure about. My Uncle Robert, he was in Iceland. He was part of the support troops there. He said all he did in Iceland was fix diesel engines. But that was part of the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
everybody that was in the war didn't fight in battles. And of course, when the war was over, I'm glad that they all came home.
Okay.
Uncle Donald was the only one that was wounded. He was wounded twice. He got 2 Purple Hearts. But I remember his statement when he came home. He says, if they ever want me to go again, they're going to have to come and get me, because I'm going to be up in the woods and they're not going to find me.
Now you mentioned earlier about the woman that worked on the farm called a farmerette. Was that a program that the government had?
Yeah, it was because of the labor being scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently these college students volunteered to work on farms wherever they were needed.
That's interesting, because I had never heard of that program before.
This girl that we had, she came from Long Island. Peggy Ocatello, I think her name was. I can't remember, it's a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but she was a college student, I know that. Yeah.
Now your mother, she worked on the farm too.
My mother never worked out. She always worked on the farm, but she always raised a huge garden
Mm-hmm.
and canned most of the food that we used throughout the year. So that's why rationing didn't really affect us. The sugar rationing bothered a little, but you could get extra sugar during canning season, so that worked out pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest problem we had with rationing was shoes. Shoes were rationed, and my brother had a problem with one of his feet and had to have corrective shoes. And of course, we were both growing so fast, we'd outgrow our shoes before they were worn out.
Mm-hmm.
But we needed new ones because they were too small. You know. I remember my father had to go to the ration board a couple of times to get extra rations, I guess
Mm-hmm.
you call it.
Now, did your family? I take it your family probably had an automobile back then.
We never had an automobile until my Uncle Donald went into the Army, and my father bought his car. And that was an old 1932 Chevy. And during the war, you couldn't get tires.
Mm-hmm.
And if you'd have seen those tires, by the time the war ended, there was no tread at all on them. They were just as bald as a tube would be.
Hmm.
And yet they still had to use them.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, we had just moved over from Rutland, and we did take a lot of eggs and vegetables over to Rutland. And, they had places where they sold them over there.
Now your parents purchased the farm over here?
That was one of the good things that came out of the war.
Mm-hmm.
The economy improved enough, and he'd only been a farm employee all of his life with no money. They had saved and scrimped, and they had $80 in the bank, which seems like peanuts today, but
Yeah.
at that time, they worked hard to save up $80, and they came to Whitehall to rent a farm, and the people who sold it to them didn't want to rent it, they wanted to sell it, and they worked out a deal, and they bought the farm. But if it hadn't been in the middle of the war, they probably never would have got
Mm-hmm.
a chance to do it.
Now, what type of farm was it? Was it a dairy?
Dairy farm, yeah.
Okay. How many cows
Back then, he had 40 cows.
during the war?
40 cows, 3 horses, and whatever old equipment was still around.
Mm-hmm. Now, basically, anything that was produced, like milk or eggs, etc., did the government buy that up,
No,
or?
they sold the milk to a cooperative,
Okay,
Dairymen's League cooperative, yeah.
okay,
Most people sold to cooperatives at that time unless they bottled and sold retail themselves.
mhm. All right. And you were probably still in elementary school at that point?
Oh yeah, I was in the 3rd grade when we moved over here.
And you,
I finished the 3rd grade at the rural school up here in Whitehall, District
Mhm.
5. And then we didn't move, but they closed the school and we moved down to William Street School here for 4th grade.
mhm. And you, in between, well, after you got home from school, you worked on the farm, or
Yeah.
did homework, or?
You had homework, but you also had chores you had to
Uh-huh.
do. Yeah.
And what about your summer vacations? You spent them working on the farm every day?
You mean the school vacation? Yeah, that was
Yes.
the only vacation we had. We didn't have summer vacations. We had school vacations,
Okay,
but we worked in the farm. Yeah.
okay. And,
It isn't as bad as it sounds. I mean, they were fun summers.
mhm. Now, what about brothers and sisters?
I had one brother and I had a sister that was born after we moved here.
Okay,
My brother is a year and a half older than me.
okay, so he helped out on the farm too.
Yeah, reluctantly. He was not the farmer type.
Okay. All right. Do you recall what it was like when the war ended?
Yeah, everybody was kind of glad because it was over and the guys were coming home.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember exactly how we heard the news. I imagine it was probably over the radio because that's where we got most of our news in those days. We did receive the daily paper too in the mail,
Mm-hmm.
which today you'd get it 3 or 4 days later, but back then you got it on the right day.
Mm-hmm.
And the radio was the big source of news, though.
Mm-hmm.
We followed the war pretty much through the radio. Of course, when you went to the movies, you would have the newsreels. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing that we had never done before we moved here and had a little better income. We'd never gone to the movies, but once we moved to a new town where we didn't know a lot of people, for a few years that was our main entertainment, was going to the movies.
Uh-huh.
And then there was organizations by folks belonged to the Grange, and that was a great social organization too. And during the war years, I think people socialized more than what
Mhm.
they do now. It seemed like you were always going to visit somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Today-
Were there a lot of suppers and dinners at those organizations? Or?
Yeah, there was dinners, and that was one of the good parts of the farming. I mean, in the summertime, because you didn't have the equipment, you shared work with your neighbors.
Uh-huh.
And you get 4 or 5 neighbors together, you get the work done a lot quicker, and the ladies of the house would put on a meal for everybody, and they would try to outdo with each other on the meal, so it was kind of a nice part of it.
Hmm.
It was so much different in those days because all your neighbors were doing the same thing you were doing. Like
Uh-huh.
if you lived in the country, most of your neighbors were farmers. Today it's not that way. Today you're lucky if you got a farmer within 5 miles of you.
Mm-hmm. Now, when the soldiers started coming back to town, I mean, was there a lot of celebration and?
Well, somewhat, yeah. We had a distant cousin of my father's who was in the Navy, and he came back and he got into what they called the 5220 Club.
Oh yes.
You remember that?
Yep.
Yeah, he had to go to Fort Ann, I think once or twice a week, maybe to take classes in agriculture, I think, and he got this $20 a week for 52 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too sure how good a program that was, but the guys that were in it sort of liked it.
Uh-huh.
It supplemented their income a little, give them a little start anyway.
Yep. Now, are there any other remembrances during the war years that you'd like to talk about?
Well, 2 things, I guess. I mentioned that we went to the movies quite often, and at the movies they always had the war bond drives and
Mhm.
sold stamps and bonds. Of course, they sold savings stamps at the schools too. All the kids bought stamps, and you were doing your part. During the whole war, everybody wanted to do their part, and just even if you only bought one stamp a week, you figured you were helping to do your part.
Mhm.
And one other time, I can remember going to Rutland, and I can't remember the date on it, but there was a huge crowd of people down where the railroad station was. That whole square was packed. There must have been 50,000 people or more, because President Roosevelt was supposed to be coming in on a train, and he did, but we couldn't see him because he was so far away, you know.
Mhm.
But that was a unique experience for me anyway.
Sure.
I think that the president was that close.
Okay, after the war years, and you went on and you graduated from high school?
Yeah, in 1952.
Okay.
I was one of the fortunate generation. I was a little bit too young for Korea and a little too old for Vietnam, so I didn't have to go in the service myself.
Okay.
My brother did. My brother spent 4 years in the Air Force.
Okay, and you went on to Cobleskill College?
Yes, agricultural college.
Okay. And what sort of, well, obviously you took farming there?
Yeah, I took animal husbandry was the name of the course.
Okay. And you graduated?
Yes.
Okay, and after you completed college, you went back to into farming?
Yeah, I never did anything else.
Okay.
That was sort of unique. I've never worked for anybody in my life, so any more than what I do right now. I mean, I work at the museum, I guess, part-time.
Uh-huh. So are you still involved in farming at all?
No, I retired 10 years ago, and
Okay.
I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, let me ask you, what sort of changes have you seen in the farming industry from the time you were a young man?
Tremendous changes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different type of an industry than what it was then. Back then, they were all family farms,
Uh-huh.
and generally all the work was done by the family. Today, you can't survive with a small farm. It's like when I started here in Whitehall, when we bought our own place, there was 67 farms, 67 families making a living on farms in this little town of Whitehall. We're down to about 5 now, and yet they're probably producing almost as much as they did back then.
Mm-hmm.
But today they've got all kinds of equipment, and it's still just as hard to get labor, I think, as it was during the war, though.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think, there was something else I was trying to remember, and I can't. When we were playing, we did have time to play, we didn't work all the time. When we were playing a lot of our games, you couldn't get toys, metal toys.
Mm-hmm.
You could get paper toys. At Christmas time, we'd get little trucks that we had to put together made out of cardboard, you know. They didn't last very long, but we made a lot of our own toys. And we'd play games. I can remember, I think it was the movie Bataan. For 2 months after that, we were digging foxholes up on the hill, making our little machine guns and toy pistols and everything, and we were fighting the Japanese. I mean, I don't know why we never fought the Germans, but we always fought the Japanese. Yeah, all my uncles were in Europe.
Uh-huh.
I don't understand that part of it, but
Well, it must have been that movie you saw, Bataan,
Well, it
must have
must have
stuck
been-
with you.
probably the publicity, the propaganda was more oriented. We were supposed to hate the Japanese, not the Germans or something.
Okay.
It's hard to imagine the attitude that most people had in those days, though. Some of it carried over from World War I. I think my grandfather hated the Huns, the Germans, you know, couldn't say anything good about the Germans. And yet, he'd never been in a war or anything. That was the attitude that people had.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is there anything else we should touch on, or you think we pretty much covered?
My life is well, like I said, the good thing about the war for us and our family was everybody survived and came back, and my folks had a chance to make a better life.
Mm-hmm.
Because during the Depression years, it was tough for people on farms in Vermont.
Okay. Now, what were your parents' names?
Paul and Catherine.
Okay. Getting back to the war, what did the returning soldiers do? Do you recall?
What did they do?
Yeah. As far as work, did they?
Most of them went back to whatever they were doing before.
Okay.
In our family, several of them were carpenters. Uncle Donald went back into driving a truck. He used to drive Pope trucks, and then he drove over-the-road trucks. Uncle Barney went back into driving truck. Uncle Robert was a carpenter. He became a real good carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Joby, he went back to, I think, probably the same job he'd had before the war. He worked for the coal company over in Rutland. I forget the name of that. It's where House Gale complex is today. Most of them pretty much tried to get back to the life they were living before.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Okay.
Did he